Hi, my name is Sophie Anderson. I'm 17 years old and grew up in Massachusetts, but now live in Brooklyn, New York. I am one of the national coordinators for Extinction Rebellion Youth US. Extinction Rebellion is a global movement advocating for climate justice through nonviolent direct action and community building. I am joined by my fellow activist Shiv Soin. We met through organizing the 300,000 person climate strike in New York City in September. Shiv is a student at NYU and the founder of Triage. Triage is a New York City-based youth-led grassroots organization building community power to pass legislation and elect climate candidates. We are honored to be here in discussion with Secretary John Kerry, who served as the former United States Secretary of State under President Barack Obama and as a Massachusetts Senator for 23 years. He earned 3 Purple Hearts from his service in Vietnam and is a best-selling author. His tenure as Secretary of State was marked by the successful negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement. So I want to start off by jumping into one of the major turning points on the discussion around climate change. Secretary Kerry, you were at the center of the Paris Climate Accords negotiations. What do you think is the single most important thing for people to know about the Paris Climate Accords as they relate to us today?
Well, first of all, Sophie, thanks. It's great to be with you. Joe, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for your activism. We desperately need people who are going to hold the politicians accountable, and I appreciate what you're doing. I think the most critical thing about Paris, there were several things, actually. Number one, I went to China with the obvious direction and support of the President of the United States to meet with President Xi. And we worked as an administration to bring the Chinese on board for the first time. We'd had a disastrous conference meeting in Copenhagen 4 years before that. It failed to move the ball forward. So number one, bringing China to the table. Number two was the fact that 196 countries came together all at the same time, all agreeing they were all going to aspirationally try to reach 1.5 degrees, holding the Earth's temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade of a rise, or 2 degrees was not aspirational, 2 degrees was the real goal. And that was based on scientific input, obviously. And when we left Paris, the third most critical thing was we knew we weren't absolutely guaranteeing we could hold the Earth's temperature to that 2 degrees. But we also knew what we were doing was sending a massive signal to the marketplace of the world that 196 countries were all going to try to move to alternative, renewable, sustainable development. And for the first time, accept a uniform initiative where everybody was doing something. The goal was to excite the market so much that the private sector began to take over, and we accelerated the process by which we were achieving it. Regrettably, with the Trump administration coming in and pulling out of that agreement, it allowed the people who we reluctantly dragged to the table and pressured to get in it, it allowed them to pull back. And now, regrettably, not one country in the world, not the United States, not anybody, is achieving what we set out to do. The biggest single reduction, I hate to say it, in emissions has come from coronavirus. This last month and a half has seen blue skies in places they haven't seen blue skies in years. And it's a lesson to everybody. But the key is when we start up our economy again in the next months, we have got to start to move faster in order to literally save the planet. And I think all of you understand that, but we've got to fight a lot harder. We've got to hold politicians more accountable. We've got to participate in the political process. If people don't go out and vote, Sophie, this isn't going to happen. Right. If politicians can have immunity, if you can stay with impunity as a denier in the United States Congress, we're cooked. So in the end, you've got to throw people out of office if they're not doing what you want them to do.
Great. Yeah. And so those Paris Climate Accords were in the youth movement. We kind of see them as this like launching point for a discussion around climate change. Shiv, can you talk a little bit about that and also the personal connection that you have to the Paris Climate Accords?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, Secretary Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. So I think you hit a really big point in terms of just what the Paris Climate Agreement did, as in bringing all the countries of the world together to actually put down some impact and be able to make these commitments. And that really broke a lot of like the glass ceiling for a lot of people in terms of information, being able to really understand what's happening with the world around us. When this was being negotiated, I was around 15 or 16. And this was right around the time I was starting to take environmental studies courses, starting to learn a little bit more about the world around me. And throughout my life, what really brought my passion for environmental organizing is I ended up getting hospitalized when I went back to my home country of India just because I couldn't breathe. And learning more about environmentalism, I just learned by reading things like the Paris Climate Accord, UN FCC papers, and things like that really made me realize what the true impacts of the climate crisis were. And I know that's the case with a lot of youth organizers, a lot of young people, and just a lot of people in general, really having the Paris Climate Accord being the nexus of just changing the conversation. And as we move forward, I think the biggest point is that yeah, a lot of countries and the majority of them are just not meeting commitments, if not all. And now we need to be able to move our politicians and hold them accountable. That's really the next step after Earth Week. That's really the next step today and where we go forward with this movement. And that starts on the local, that starts on the state, and that also is on the federal level. We can't ignore any elected official. We have to make sure every single person we're putting into office is looking out for the interest of the working people of this country and not for these fossil fuel emitters, not for these companies that just are dragging us down.
Well, look, that's the only way it works, my friend, and I don't say that with any with any arrogance. I just say it with the experience of a long journey, which started for me, not unlike you, when I was a heck of a lot younger. But when I came back from service in Vietnam, the first thing I did was become involved in Earth Day, 1970. I was there for the first Earth Day. I helped organize in New England. And we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on this one day, first time that had happened, to demonstrate that they didn't want to live next to a toxic waste site. They didn't want to drink water that made their kids sick, they didn't want to get cancer from a dump nearby. And they wanted environmental responsibility. Back then, you couldn't see across Los Angeles or across New York City. And so this resonated with people. And we didn't stop just coming out on the one day. We translated it into a political movement, and we targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen. All the major environmental groups came together. People put money on the line for advertising. We targeted them, labeled them the Dirty Dozen. And when the election took place, 7 of the 12 were defeated. You know what happened? And I'll tell you this after 28 years in the Senate running for office, the survivors all understood, oh my gosh, this is a voting issue. Environment is a voting issue. And the result was a torrent of legislation was unleashed. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, marine mammal protection, coastal zone management, endangered species, and above all, we created the Environmental Protection Agency for the United States. We didn't even have one until then. And the Republican president, Richard Nixon, signed it into law. So that was the birth of the modern environmental movement. It came about because people just got pissed off and said, we're not going to sit here and be told we have to breathe polluted air and so forth. Well, today, we've probably got more than 100 deniers in the United States Congress. They sit there with impunity. And I hate to say this to you, but in 2016, when this guy who was the only president, only leader of a country in the world to pull out of the Paris Agreement, when today we're in a place where the United States has become the scofflaw of the world. But the fact is that we have the ability to be able to change that. You have the ability to be able to change that. In 2015, despite this man's positions on these issues, only 19% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 decided to vote. So you look at what we have today, a guy who pulls out of Paris, and compare it to where we were in 2016 in voting. So I don't want to be, the scold here, but I have to say to you, if we want to win back our future, if we want to do what we need to do, which we have to do within the next 9 years to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, we have to win back the votes that have to be there to make it happen. There's just no other way. Not going to happen otherwise. So I want to see the largest turnout of voters overall. In 2016, the overall vote was 55.6%, a 20-year low. 9% of President Obama's vote went to Donald Trump, and 7% didn't even bother to come out. So we began that election with a 16-point deficit, if you will. My friends, very simple. I love what Climate Strike has done, what Extinction Rebellion has done, what Sunrise Movement, all of the efforts of people to say, wait a minute, we got to do this. But the way we're going to do it, the biggest serve up on a platter is November 3rd, 2020, when we make it clear to people this climate change, the crisis, is a voting issue now in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. And voting and mobilizing the vote is like core to the movement that we've built. And I know that we're working really hard to kind of bring out voter turnout, especially with Earth Day Live. That's kind of a part of this whole initiative, is especially getting young people out to vote, because kind of even the education around like registering to vote is really lacking. So that's been something that we've been trying to provide as well.
Great, fabulous.
Yeah. This kind of transitions well into the next topic that I wanted to bring up. A phrase that we use a lot in the movement is think global, but act local. Secretary Kerry, I know that you've been involved in the full spectrum of politics from local to global. How do you think that we can maximize local engagement on the issue of climate change?
Well, I think there are different tiers of that, Sophie. I think that first of all, everybody has to get over this notion, oh, I'm just one person. Little old me can't make a difference. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It's everybody coming together that makes the difference. But if each individual doesn't make the choice to be engaged, you never get there. So we need everybody. Secondly, there are things you can do. You may think they're small, but let me just tell you, in Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard, the kids in middle school seized the initiative to say, we're going to get rid of single-use plastic. And so they managed to not only get rid of single-use plastic, but they got rid of, plastic bags being handed out at the grocery store, et cetera. So no more plastic bags. And that makes a huge difference. You can make a difference in the choices that you make about lights in your house, what your parents are doing, what kind of car is your family driving, or cars, if you're lucky enough. And the time has come to be driving an electric vehicle. And that most people in the country never go over 150, 200 miles, most people, in a day. So you can recharge. Well, most electric cars get over 300, 370. They're about to get more than 400 next generation. So we need to be making individual choices that have an impact. What you eat, when you turn on the heat, what you do, all those kinds of personal choices. Thirdly, in your community, you can make a difference on your street, in your community, at your school. Whatever you're doing, you could be doing something that moves your school, that street, your community to some kind of broader civic activity that will save energy or be cleaner or greener or so forth. So it's a huge power. What kind of products you buy. I mean, start writing to stores and telling them you're not going to buy these products because you know they're made with a huge carbon footprint, and that's unacceptable. So you can have power in the marketplace. Get all the other kids at your school to let your local community know that you're not going to behave, you're not going to do a certain thing, you're not going to, you know, buy certain products that they want to sell that you know are not good. I mean, there's a long list of things. And then finally, be active politically. I mean, I don't care, you know, I do care, but I mean, I'm not going to, it's not the criteria by which you should measure it, but whether you're Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative, no party at all, whatever, it is critical to be engaged to hold the public people accountable.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off of that too, we also should be focusing on the local level in local and state races, for example. I mean, Sophie, you and I both organize and work in New York. And as we've seen last year, New York State passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the largest, most progressive legislation that's been passed in this country in regards to climate. Although it's not perfect, there are still so many steps that were made, and we can continue to build upon that. And on the flip side, just I think 2 days ago, Kentucky passed a voter ID law that restricts people to vote with and you only can use a voter ID. The only issue is right now during this pandemic, every place to get voter ID has been shut. So these state legislatures have so much power over us and control so many aspects of our daily life, whether it's good with the CLCPA that was passed in New York State or bad with voter suppression just right now in Kentucky just a few days ago.
Yeah.
So for us,
and you know what else they do, Shiv? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you know what else the local legislature does? They actually write your congressional districts.
Yeah.
So who's in your legislature is critical to preventing the gerrymandering, which is the purposeful drawing of a district so only one person could win, only one party. We have to get over that. We just don't have a real democracy until we end the gerrymandering in the United States.
Yeah, fundamentally at the local level, we need to build up power and just make people believe that we can get these things done. As we start building and electing candidates at the local, state, and people will start electing candidates at the federal level rather than what just happened in 2016, because we need strong policies that people will believe in. And I think for young people in particular, that is a really amazing place to start, just like talking to your city council members, and learning who your assembly members are, state senators, and being able to contact them. They are extremely accessible. They are able to meet with you and get legislation passed and be able to work with a lot of people and a lot of community members.
For
and
sure.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, for sure. I guarantee you, if you get your friends and you talk your family and you get everybody in a broader environment to go out and vote and everybody else is doing the same thing, you're going to win. You'd be amazed. You will literally win the future.
And Sophie, I know Extinction Rebellion in particular has been doing a lot of great things in regards to just like bringing people who may not be those organizers who are interested in directly like talking to the elected leaders. I know you were doing a lot of things in regards to art. How does that kind of tie in with Earth Week and just the movement in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because I love to talk about it. Especially, Extinction Rebellion like has a real focus on local organizing and building community. Like that's really built into our DNA. We believe that like local organizing is the foundation of all of the work that we do because we have that in-person connection. And one way that we've really built our community over the last year, especially into like over 50 groups in the United States, is through kind of two things. One is like our focus on regenerative culture, and that really means like building communities that self-sustain, that take care of one another, and really envisioning kind of like the future that we want to exist. And the second is through art, like you mentioned, Shiv. We found that like art and storytelling is a really effective way to bring people into the movement and to unite people across political parties and from different walks of life. So we've kind of used that as a tool through our activism, and it has helped us grow in like amazing ways. And we did that with September 20th too. I think part of the reason that we got so many people out is just through like doing art builds and like connecting people through stories, because the numbers like seem really abstract, and I think it's hard to read through all of the bad news, but reminding people that we can connect around kind of the core of why we're doing our activism is part of what has like made us so successful. Shiv, can you tell us a little bit more about Triage and kind of why you decided to found that and kind of the core of what you're doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to the discussion we were just having about building up this local power. The results of the people I've been talking to throughout this presidential primary, throughout years past, have always been talking to me about just this disillusion with government, because a lot of things on the federal level just have been stalled and people don't really pay that close attention to their state and local governments. And in New York, for example, just this last session, we passed over 900 bills. There is so much action happening on this level, and there's so much influence that we can have, and it's affecting our daily lives. So by putting our power of youth in communities and being able to organize with our friends and family, that has a lot of power that just hasn't really been tapped into yet effectively. So what we're trying to do at Triage is really bring our young people together, send them back into their community. And whether that's organizing with your block, whether that's organizing just in your friend circle or your parents, anything like that, that builds so much power, and you're able to, as a block together, be able to message your congressperson, be able to vote together for this specific election that's coming up, a special election that might happen for city council, where they're looking to fight for actual people and they're not taking money from fossil fuel executives. I think what really is happening is so many people are ignoring what's happening on the local level. So Triage is filling in that gap, especially in New York, for people to build up that local power. Because as Secretary Kerry said a little bit earlier, as we build up local power, these state legislatures affect everything, including the federal level as well. So we start from there and we build up, and we can get more policies and more solutions implemented on all levels of government.
Absolutely. And I think also, like, kind of tying into that, Shiv, another thing that, like, I think both parts of our movement, and we've been really involved in, is kind of getting youth a seat at the table. And that was like one of our key demands for the December 6th strike, is really making sure that like the youth voice that we have that is so distinctive is heard. And one way to do that is through like making advisory boards with youth, through like companies and nonprofits, because that's like another key part of this crisis, is kind of unregulated businesses, but also like advisory councils in government, because we found that like we are informed and we are mobilized, and the next progression is really to make sure that like we have a seat at the decision-making table. Yeah, so just kind of to close off, I wanted to ask you, Secretary Kerry, if there's any other questions that you'd like to ask me or Shiv, or any kind of final words of advice that you'd give us.
Well, my final words of advice are not to really give you advice because you know what you're doing. I really admire your commitment on this. You're going to be the difference. Young folks are going to reclaim this. And I want to just leave with you a thought that historically, the great movements that have made a difference in our country have more often than not been fueled, if not led, but certainly fueled by young people who make a commitment to do it. I remember in the 1960s when I first became engaged in this, we became involved in the civil rights movement. We got buses to send down to the South. Students took time off from school to go down and be part of the Mississippi voter registration drive and break the back of Jim Crow. People were involved in the environment movement, the peace movement. I'm convinced the war in Vietnam ended sooner than it would have, because young people voiced their sense of conscience. And on women and women's movement, and you know, the things that we won earlier on in Title IX and other things came about with young people demanding accountability. So I love what you're doing. I think it is critical to our ability to be able to win the future. You're going to make the difference. And those aren't just words. I mean, this reality that I just described to you, you know, when young people went up to New Hampshire in 1968 for Gene McCarthy to end the war in Vietnam, they were 20 people to an apartment living off peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Everybody was, they were called the Peanut Butter and Jelly Brigade. And when Gene McCarthy, he didn't win, but when he got 44% of the vote, the President of the United States knew he was finished. It was over. And that's exactly what happened. They literally ended the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And that was a young people's movement. And the same thing has to happen now. No politician should be allowed to vote against doing what we need to do to beat the climate crisis, which we can do, but we can't do it without a Congress. And so no congressperson should be able to be there for 10 seconds without realizing there is accountability. Young people are going to hold the system accountable, make it work, and they better vote for common sense and for science and for facts and truth, rather than for some stupid, blind, ideology or fear of a president and his retaliation.
Great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Thank you, guys. Thanks for what you're doing. And make sure Earth Day is everything it needs to be.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.